Hello and welcome to Elite Wine and Whisky. Today we're going to be talking about the heritage of Scotch whisky production, how it's made and why it's made that way. While each distillery will have their own unique takes on certain methods, we hope to outline the general heritage and production of Scottish single malt whisky here today. Whisky has been made in Scotland for centuries, though in very different forms to what we think of as whisky today. When we talk about early Scottish whisky, our first historical reference comes from 1494 in the Exchequer Rolls. There we have an order from King James IV to Friar John Core, with 8 bowls of malt to make aqua vitae. Now while this might seem small, a bowl is an old Scottish measurement making some 65 kilograms. With that much malted barley, a modern day distillery could make an odd 1,500 bottles of whisky. That phrase aqua vitae carries weight too. It's Latin, meaning water of life, and its Gaelic counterpart, uiscibitha, would evolve through the years, eventually becoming the word whisky. The whisky that Friar John Core distilled would not all have been for drinking, however. Its use in chemistry and medicine cannot be understated. It likely would have been a far cry from what we think of whisky today, maybe flavoured with herbs, spices, local flowers, all to add to the flavour. Whisky in name, not in nature. So with all that said, how is whisky made? Well, it begins with barley. All alcohols require a crop to make, whether it's grapes, corn, potatoes, anything from which sugar can be extracted for fermentation and distillation. Scotland found that its plentiful supply of barley could be used to brew beer, and then later that could be distilled into whisky. While today there are industry standard barley strains used, in the old days the variety of barley would have been different all over. A distillery in the Scottish lowlands may have used local grown barley or bought in malted barley from elsewhere, but a distiller in the highlands, whether legal or illicit, would have used different barley. The breeding of barley to create the strains we know and love today takes years of work, and we have seen a slew of varietals become the industry norm, only to fall to the wayside when something more efficient, cheaper, or more flavourful emerges, and it is down to the distillery as to what they will use. First comes the malting. Here the barley is steeped in water before being spread over malting floors and being turned regularly to prevent heat buildup. What we're doing here is germinating the barley, tricking it into thinking it is time to sprout so the starch inside can be converted to sugar. Once it is converted, however, if it were to sprout, it would consume that sugar we need for our alcohol, so we kiln it. Running this green malt through a kiln, it is subjected to heats below 70 degrees Celsius, stopping the germination while also retaining those vital enzymes we need for our production. Should we wish to peat our whisky, this is when the peat would be added, smouldering beneath the barley and releasing smoke. This smoky flavour, which can differ depending on where the peat has been harvested, seeps into the barley and is still retained in our whisky. We have our malted barley. That peated whisky is an interesting point. In the modern world, peated whisky is thriving, with people discovering the delights of its flavour each day, though it was not always this way. Peating your whisky today is optional, but in the early days of whisky production in Scotland, most whisky would have been peated. In areas that see little coal, you had the option of burning either wood or peat to dry your barley. Wood can be used for many things. Burning it down means you are burning down part of a house, a cart, and of course you will be taking away natural cover you would have to hide against the taxman. Such a thing ensures you would not operate for too much longer, so peat was used instead with all the smoky flavours it adds. In the mid-19th century, we saw the advent of the Highland Railway. With the railway, coal could be transported all over the country, negating the need for peat use as coal could be easily purchased and the peated flavours soon fell off. Helping with this, blenders would also turn away from peated whisky, the smoky flavour being so powerful that it might ruin or throw off the taste they desired. Due to this, peated whisky almost died out, living only on the likes of the Isle of Islay, and it wasn't until the 90s that peated whisky saw a resurgence, usually attributed to the reopening of Ardbeg Distillery. Next, we mash our whisky. The malted barley ground down to a flour or grist before being mixed with hot water in a mash tun. This is done over 3 stages, each of which increase the temperature, starting at 67 degrees Celsius and reaching almost boiling point. We see a lot of water being used at this point and through the entirety of production. Because of the amount of water needed, historically distilleries were built where there was a steady supply of running water, next to locks, next to burns, or at the base of mountains with a snowmelt. We stir constantly and now have what is called wort. It's time to turn it into alcohol with fermentation. The wort is cooled and moved to washbacks. Here distilleries will add their yeast. The yeast feast on the sugars inside the wort, converting the sugar into alcohol, and depending on what kind of washbacks we have, steel, wooden, the size, the location, different flavors can arise at this point in time. After a few days we have our wash, our alcohol. It sits around 6 to 8% and is ready for distillation through copper pot stills. Now while you might hear some people say that Scotch whisky is always double distilled, this is not true. You can double distill, triple distill, anywhere in between. It is down to the distillery and the master distiller on what character they are looking for and how they feel their spirit is treated best. Those copper pots also influence the flavour and character of the whisky. Some distilleries may favour shorter, squatter stills. Others might favour tall, long-necked stills. The size and shape of a still influences the final product, even down to dents. And for this reason, distilleries will keep their stills the same shape even when purchasing new ones, all to retain their unique flavour and distillery character. And the reasoning for copper is simple. It was cheap, it's malleable, it's a great conductor of heat and acts as a catalyst to help remove volatile compounds. Those who in the early days of whisky production used other metals would find their spirit tasting very different. And when we talk about single malt whisky, by Scottish law, it must be produced through copper pot stills. Our first still is the wash still. Distilling our liquid while also separating it from any residual solids which will head into animal feed. Once distilled through the wash still, we have our low wines, typically around 20% alcohol, so it's not ready yet. Our second still, the spirit still, is what makes the magic. Running through the still, the more volatile compounds and alcohols run off first. We call these the foreshots or the heads. These heavier cuts are sent off and will be mixed in with the next batch of low wines. The final piece to be distilled are the feints or tails and are similarly treated. It's the middle cut we want, the hearts. The hearts are collected, running into the spirits receiver, from there into the spirit safe, and finally we have our new make spirit. This sits around 63.5% alcohol, and though we've worked hard to get to this point, we're not finished yet. We have to mature our spirit for 3 years before we can call it whiskey. So why do we need to wait 3 years? In 1915, teetotal Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, was advocating and fighting hard to restrict alcohol sales, even attempting to bring in a total prohibition during the First World War. This was understandably met with pushback from multiple angles, so instead Lloyd George compromised and presented the Immature Spirits Restrictions Act of 1915. The act initially prohibited the sale of spirits younger than 2 years old, later increased to 3 years old. While this was meant to be detrimental to the industry, some saw the act as saving whiskey. While distilleries had been aging their whiskey for some time, their reputation often suffered when other, less scrupulous producers would market spirit that was either new make, incredibly young, or a blend of new make and aged whiskey. The act, while hoping to cripple the industry, went a long way into solidifying whiskey's place as a premium spirit. By Scottish law, maturation must take place in oak vessels. They might be new casks, never before used, they may have contained sherry, port, or most commonly bourbon, and they could be from anywhere around the world, but are most commonly American or French oak. These casks are filled with new make spirit and taken to a warehouse where they sleep slowly and mature for years. As they do, the spirit inside moves into and out of the wooden staves, taking in the flavour of the wood and anything else that it may have previously contained. While today we recognise the advantages of oak aging, it wasn't always this way. Casks and barrels were originally used as a method of transportation and storage, maturation coming second and being an afterthought. In fact, the main flavour used to come more from herbs and spices that would be added, making it more akin to a gin than to a whiskey. 3 years later, it's ready for bottling, but it might not stop there. All over Scotland, all over the world, casks are maturing long past that required 3 years, each year changing the whiskey ever so softly. It might be aged 3 years, 12 years, 21, 30, or even older. Some whiskies have been aged as long as more than 70 years. It all depends on when the whiskey is ready, and finally it is bottled, purchased, and sipped. The history, the heritage of whiskey production can be tasted in every bottle of Scotch whiskey. That heritage has come a long way, trickling down through the years, through the pot stills to finally reach your glass, and every year new distilleries, casks, and people are adding to that heritage. Now there is nothing more to do except pour a whiskey, have a sip, and ponder the heritage. Sláinte.